Have you ever opened a door on the darkest night, knowing that death could be on the other side, yet still you opened it? 1887, Arizona territory. A winter storm lashes the Powder Ridge Mountains with icy rain that cuts like knives. Mara Ellison, a widow who has lost everything, husband, son, her name, lives alone in a cabin at the edge of the abyss. Everyone in Shadow Bend had written her off as dead in life. Until one night of furious rain, someone knocks on her door with such desperation that it sounds like the last heartbeat of the world. What happened next changed 3 lives forever and made the entire town tremble. If you dare to know what happened when Mara opened that door, stay until the end. Subscribe now. Share where you're listening from, Mexico, Spain, Argentina, Chile, and let me know in the comments. Would you have opened it? Because this story is not about cowboys or bullets. It's about courage, redemption, and a love that was born under the coldest rain. Let's begin. The December wind of 1887 entered through the cracks of the cabin like a rusty knife. The rain pounded the tin roof with the fury of war drums, and each drop seemed to scream the same name that Mara Ellison never spoke anymore. Jack. Jack Ellison had died 2 winters ago, buried under tons of rock in Union Ridge Mines Gallery No. 3. Along with him were 27 other men, and a child who had yet to be born, whom Mara felt slip away one night of blood and pain between her legs. The town called it an accident. Asher Pike, the mine owner, and the man who owned nearly everything that moved in Shadow Bend, called it production costs. Mara called it murder, but no one listened. After the burial, the doors closed. The women looked away in the store, and the men spat on the ground when she passed. A widow without family is worse than a widow without money. She's a nuisance, a reminder that the land here swallows people whole. The cabin stood high on Powder Ridge, where the road ended and oblivion began. One room, a chimney that smoked more than it warmed, a wobbly table, and a bed that creaked like old bones. Mara lived on rabbit traps, roots, and herbs a Shoshone woman had taught her before they chased her off the territory. She sold little, bought less. She spoke to no one. Sometimes, when the moon was high and the wind paused for a second, she swore she could hear the cry of the child who never breathed. Then, she'd squeeze the trigger of the old Winchester hanging above the door and remind herself that she had nothing left to lose. That night, the storm came from the northwest like a runaway train. The water leaked through the roof, falling into buckets inside a rusted pot. The lantern barely lit the room. The wick floated in a pool of kerosene. Mara sat by the fire, cleaning Jack's revolver with a rag that had once been her wedding shirt, when the first knock sounded on the door. Loud, dry, human. She froze. In these mountains, no one knocks at midnight, unless they carry death in their pocket or in their blood. She remembered the time she'd opened the door to 2 drunks seeking shelter and ended up with a knife to her throat until she shot them dead. Since then, the door had 3 bolts and 1 rule. Whoever knocks after sundown, let them die outside. The second knock was weaker, but more desperate, as though someone were falling to their knees. Mara stood up. The wooden floor creaked beneath her worn boots. The wind howled so fiercely that it seemed the entire mountain wanted to come inside. She grabbed the Winchester, disengaged the safety with a click that sounded too loud in the silence between thunder. The third knock came, accompanied by a broken voice, almost drowned out by the rain. "Please. My son. He's dying." It was a man's voice, but it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a plea. And beneath that plea, Mara heard something worse, the weak, almost inaudible cry of a child. She gritted her teeth until they ached. Her finger on the trigger trembled for a split second. Then, with a calmness that surprised even her, she slid the 3 bolts back. The door slammed open, and the night rushed in. A tall man, wrapped in a wool blanket soaked and stained with dark blood, collapsed to his knees on the threshold. In his arms, he carried a small bundle that didn't move. The rain and wind whipped Mara's face like lashes. The man raised his head. Beneath the black hair clinging to his forehead, dark eyes looked at her without pleading now, only with an ancient resignation. "Save him, please." And then he collapsed face first onto the pine floor. The child, no older than 5 or 6, lay on his back between the father's lifeless arms. His skin was the color of cold ash. Mara slammed the door with a kick, bolted it, and knelt by the fire. For the first time in 2 years, the cabin was no longer empty. And outside, the storm seemed to laugh at what had just begun. Mara dragged the man to the worn rug by the fireplace, leaving a red trail that the firelight made gleam like freshly melted copper. The child weighed less than a wet sack of flour. She placed him on her own bed, stripped him of his soaked clothes, and wrapped him in the only good blanket she had left. Noden, that was the boy's name, she would learn later, had purple lips and skin as cold as iron in January. She rubbed his chest with pine snow and aguardiente, then forced a bitter infusion of willow bark and epazote between his teeth. An old Shoshone woman had sworn it would return a soul to a body. Tahanan didn't move for hours. Blood still flowed from a deep wound under his left rib and another on his right shoulder. Bullets, not a knife. Mara heated the branding iron until it glowed orange, sank it into the flesh, and smelled the stench of burning hair and human flesh. Tahanan didn't even grunt. He just clenched his teeth until they cracked. When she finished stitching him up with fishing line and a harness needle, the wall clock marked 3 in the morning, and the storm kept pounding as if it wanted to tear the mountain down. At dawn, the water in the ravine had turned into a brown river. Tahanan opened his eyes suddenly, as if he had never been unconscious. His hand instinctively searched for the knife that was no longer at his waist. Seeing Mara sitting in the chair, the Winchester across her lap, he relaxed his fingers. "Where's my son?" "He's breathing. He's alive because he didn't freeze completely." Tahanan sat up too quickly. The world spun, and he fell back. Mara didn't move to help him. He looked at her for a long time, sizing her up, as one might measure a wolf that hasn't yet decided whether to bite. "I don't have money to pay you." "I don't want it." "Then why?" Mara shrugged. The question was too big for the small room. "Because I know what it's like to lose a child." For the following days, the rain never stopped, but it turned fine and constant, like tears that no longer know how to stop. On the 3rd day, Tahanan stood up, unsteady, and started paying back the debt no one had asked for. He fixed the door the wind had knocked off its hinges, reinforced the roof with old tin, chopped firewood until the pile reached the eaves. He did it in silence, with efficient movements that spoke of someone raised between cliffs and horses. Noden, barely recovered, followed him like a shadow, a thin child with huge eyes who clung to Mara's legs every time she went near the fire. One afternoon, while Mara ground coffee in the mortar, the little boy came over and without a word leaned his head against her hip. It was such a simple gesture. It burned her more than the red-hot iron. Tahanan saw it from the doorway, and something moved behind his eyes, something that was neither gratitude nor distrust, but something older and more dangerous. By the 5th day, the rain eased enough for the valley to be visible. Mara went out to check the traps and found fresh tracks. 4 horses, shod, heavy, with large spurs. Bounty hunters. She ran back, her heart pounding in her throat. Tahanan already knew. He was sharpening the axe by the fire, the blade singing against the stone. "They're coming," he said without looking up. "How many?" "4. Maybe 5. Pike doesn't skimp when he wants Apache heads." Mara loaded the Winchester and Jack's old Schofield. She counted 6 rounds in each. She looked at the boy sleeping by the fire, then at the man who was no longer a stranger. "How much time do we have?" "Until the mud dries enough for the horses to climb without breaking their legs. 2 days, maybe less." Tahanan lifted his gaze. For the first time, there was something like a question in his eyes. "You don't have to die with us," Mara spat into the fire. "This is my house, and no one comes in unless I say so." The silence that followed was so dense that the rain seemed to stop for a moment to listen. Then Tahanan nodded slowly, as if accepting a pact sealed with blood. That night, for the first time, they all slept under the same roof, without anyone keeping watch. Outside, the water kept falling, washing the mountain, preparing the ground for what was to come. And inside, in the cabin that smelled of smoke, dried blood, and bitter coffee, something had just been born that neither of them dared to name yet. The rain had turned into a constant murmur, like a distant river that no longer threatened, but wouldn't leave either. On the 6th day, the mud began to set, and the horse tracks deepened. Tahanan barely slept. He was out before dawn, returning at twilight with hares, or a small deer slung over his shoulder, blood dripping onto his moccasins. He never spoke about where he had been. Mara never asked. She just counted the cartridges and sharpened the kitchen knife until it could cut a sheet of paper mid-air. One morning, while she was boiling coffee on the stove, Tahanan entered soaked and placed a bundle of crumpled bills and a rusty brass badge on the table. "Deputy U.S. Marshal, Territory of Arizona." The badge had a bullet hole right through the center. "I found them in the Eastern Creek," he said. 2 dead. The other 2 are still alive and heading this way." Mara looked at the bills. They were large, $100 bills, stained with dried blood. "Reward for your head." "And for Noden's. Pike raised the price after I killed the foreman who tried to hang him in front of me." That night, by the fire, Tahanan spoke for the first time without anyone prying the words from him. He told how he had worked 2 seasons in Union Ridge, hauling dynamite for $3 a day and the promise of flour for his people. He told how he saw Asher Pike sign the order to blow up Gallery 3 because the men were demanding back wages, and because beneath that vein lay sacred land for the Arapaho. 27 men and 1 child who was never born. The same Pike who now paid $500 for every Apache, dead or alive. When he finished, the silence was so heavy that the crackling fire sounded like gunshots. Mara stood, opened the drawer of the table, and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. Jack Ellison's burial receipt, signed by Pike himself. She placed it beside the bullet-ridden badge. "Then we're on the same side of hell now," she said. Tahanan nodded. For the first time, his eyes were not shards of obsidian. They were embers. The next morning, the 4 riders appeared on the slope, like vultures already smelling the carrion. They wore long raincoats and new Winchester rifles. The one in front raised his hand and shouted toward the cabin. "Woman, bring out the Indian and the brat, or we'll burn it all down." Noden hid behind Mara's skirts. Tahanan already had the axe in hand, and the look of a man who had decided to die standing. Mara opened the door wide, the Schofield in her right hand and the rifle in her left. "Come in if you've got the balls." The first shot tore through the air and shattered the doorframe. Mara's old dog, Buck, ran out barking like a demon and lunged at the nearest horse's neck. The second shot split him in 2 mid-leap. He fell without a whimper. Something inside Mara broke with a dry snap. She aimed and fired. The man in the raincoat fell backward, his face turned to pulp. Tahanan moved like lightning, the axe whistling. The second hunter tried to turn his rifle. The axe cleaved his chest from collarbone to belly. The third fired at point-blank range, and the bullet grazed Tahanan's arm, tearing flesh. Mara shot again. The man doubled over and hung from the stirrup, dragged by the frenzied horse. The fourth, a boy no older than 20, dropped his rifle and raised his trembling hands. "Don't shoot! Please, don't shoot!" Tahanan looked at him for an eternal second. Then he lowered the axe. "Go. Tell Pike that next time I'll come for him." The boy spurred his horse and disappeared down the ravine, leaving a trail of mud and fear. When the dust settled, only 3 corpses remained. 1 dead dog, and the metallic scent of gunpowder hanging in the damp air. Mara knelt beside Buck, closed his eyes, and petted his head one last time. Tahanan approached, bleeding, and placed a hand on her shoulder. He said nothing. It wasn't needed. In that instant, they knew there was no turning back. The mountain had marked all 3 of them with the same blood. Friend, if you're feeling this story in your gut like I am right now, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it helps me keep telling the stories that no one else dares to tell. Because what comes next is the day Shadow Bend learned what happens when you push a woman who has nothing left to lose. Shadow Bend smelled of rotten mud and fear as the 3 descended the slope the following afternoon. Tahanan led the way, limping, his arm in a sling made from a dead man's shirt. Mara carried Noden on her hip, and the Schofield tucked into her waistband. The surviving bounty hunter's horse had left an easy trail. The whole town knew they were coming. The main street was a swamp. Men stood beneath the eaves. Women closed shutters. No one greeted them. Sheriff Harlan, a fat man with a tin star he had bought, was waiting in the middle of the street with 4 armed deputies. "End of the road, Indian," he growled. "And you, Mara, should be ashamed to walk with this scum." Mara spat on the ground. "My shame died with Jack in your mine, Harlan. Show me the arrest warrant, or get out of the way." The sheriff smiled without amusement and gestured toward the crowd closing in behind him. "Around here, the warrant comes from Pike." And then he appeared. Asher Pike, stepping down from the saloon porch as though the world belonged to him. New Stetson hat, black frock coat, nickel-plated revolver hanging low. Behind him, 6 gunslingers with faces like pit bulls. "Miss Ellison," Pike said in that smooth voice he used to buy souls, "you've made a grave mistake protecting this savage. Hand over the boy and the Apache, and maybe I'll forget you killed white men." Noden clung tighter to Mara's neck. Tahanan stepped forward. Fresh blood stained his bandage. "The boy is mine, and I'm not a savage. I'm a witness." A murmur ran through the street like wind in dry grass. Pike raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent at once. "A witness to what, Redskin? Here, the only crime is yours." Then, from the corner of the blacksmith shop, a small figure moved between the legs of the curious. Leary, the Arapaho girl Tahanan had saved 2 years ago, her wet braid and burning eyes. "A witness to the fact that you had my father killed for not selling the land," she said in a clear voice that cut through the air. "A witness to the fact that you blew up a Gallery 3 to bury the men who knew too much. A witness to the fact that you pay for Apache heads like they're coyotes." The silence was so absolute that even the water dripping from the eaves could be heard. Pike paled beneath the dust. Lies. They're all lies. Tahanan reached into his leather bag and pulled out a bundle of papers stained with mud and blood. Mine maps, signed orders, a list of names crossed out in red ink. He held them high above his head. I found this in the foreman's pocket when I killed him. Here's everything. The Arapaho land, the dynamite in Gallery 3, shipments of rifles to the Mexicans so they can fight each other and leave us a clear path." Pike lost his composure. He drew his revolver and fired 2 shots into the air. "Fire! Kill all 3 of them!" The 6 gunslingers raised their rifles. But Shadow Bend was no longer the same town. An old miner, a widower like Mara, lowered his assistant's weapon. Another did the same. A woman screamed the name of her husband, who had died in Gallery 3. Sheriff Harlan took a step back, the star trembling on his chest. The first real shot came from Pike. The bullet grazed Tahanan's ear and splintered the saloon post. Then all hell broke loose. Mara shoved Noden behind a watering trough and opened fire with both hands. Tahanan ran forward, the axe raised high, like a wolf with nothing left to lose. Leary, from the blacksmith's roof, began firing arrows with iron tips that whistled like wasps. The gunslingers fell one by one. Pike retreated toward the saloon, firing blindly. Mara saw him, aimed between his eyes, and pulled the trigger. The shot thundered down the street like a final roar. Asher Pike stood still for a moment, a perfect hole in his forehead. Then he collapsed to his knees and fell face first into the mud, his hat rolling like a broken wheel. When the smoke cleared, only the wounded were moaning, and the whole town was staring at the ground. Tahanan, bleeding from 3 new wounds, approached Pike's dead body, spat on the corpse, and spoke loudly so everyone could hear. "This land has no owner anymore." Then he turned to Mara, and for the first time, smiled just slightly. "Let's go home." And Shadow Bend, for the first time in years, didn't know what to say. Spring arrived at Powder Ridge like a knife cutting through the fog, suddenly and without warning. One day, the wind stopped smelling like gunpowder and started smelling like pine resin and freshly turned earth. The cabin was no longer the same. Tahanan had built a new corral with straight logs, replaced the roof with planks from the abandoned sawmill, and hung an oak door that weighed as heavy as the guilt of an entire town. No one in Shadow Bend dared charge him a penny. Noden ran barefoot around the yard, chasing chickens that no longer belonged to anyone, shouting, "Mama Mara!" every time he tripped and got back up with his knees full of mud. The first time he said it, Mara froze in the middle of the garden, the hoe suspended in the air, and felt something inside her chest, open like an old wound, finally healing. She didn't cry. Women like her no longer had tears to spare. Tahanan spent his days fixing what the war had broken, helping widows rebuild fences, teaching the valley's children to track deer without making a sound, hauling sacks of flour to the Apache families still hiding in the canyons. He never accepted payment. He said the debt was his, and that it was paid with work, not money. One April afternoon, when the sun sank red behind the mountains, Tahanan returned from town with a folded piece of paper in his pocket. He placed it on the table without saying a word. It was the deed to the old cabin and 100 acres around it, signed by the judge from Tucson and sealed with red wax. Below, in firm handwriting, transferred to Mara Ellison and those she considers family. Mara read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the Bible she never opened anymore. "I don't want it," she said. "I know," he replied, "but the land wants you, and us." That night, they ate roasted venison and beans with chili that burned the tongue. Noden fell asleep with his head in Mara's lap as she pulled thorns from his hair with her fingers. Tahanan washed the dishes in silence, looking out the window at the distant lights of Shadow Bend. When the boy's breathing deepened and became regular, Tahanan spoke without turning around. "My people say the spirits choose where to plant their bones. Mine have already chosen here, if you'll let us." Mara stood, went to the door, and opened it wide. The spring air came in, fresh, filled with the scent of sage and distant rain. Outside, the full moon bathed the new corral and the garden that was starting to turn green. "It's not a matter of letting us," she said. "It's a matter of staying." Tahanan approached from behind, still not touching her. She felt his warmth just 2 steps away. "Then we stay." And for the first time since Jack went down into the mine, Mara didn't lock the door with 3 bolts. She left it open all night. The years that followed were hard, as the frontier always is, but they were no longer solitary. Noden grew tall and quiet, with his father's eyes and Mara's aim. Tahanan taught the valley boys to read the clouds and respect the silence of the mountain. Mara opened a small school in the cabin. White, Mexican, and Apache children sat on the same bench, learning numbers and letters, while she treated scraped knees with the same herbs that once saved a half-dead boy. Shadowbend never apologized with words. But one day, they planted a tree in front of the blacksmith shop in memory of the 27 from Gallery 3. The next year, another tree appeared, and another. Now there is a small grove where there was once only mud and fear. And every evening, when the sun sinks behind Powder Ridge, Mara steps onto the porch with a cup of bitter coffee. Tahanan sits beside her in silence, and Noden runs around the corral, inventing names for the horses that are now his. The oak door is still there, solid and heavy. No one needs to close it anymore. Because that stormy night in 87, when the rain lashed like bullets and the world seemed to end, Mara Ellison opened a door and let in, forever, the one thing the frontier had never given her, a home. And that's where this raw and true story from Arizona in 1887 ends. A door that was opened on the worst night and closed forever on the darkest chapter of 3 lives. Now it's your turn. Would you have opened that door knowing what was waiting on the other side? Or would you have left it closed and continued living with the silence? Leave your answer in the comments. No filters, just like it's talked about on the frontier. I read absolutely everything. Thank you for sticking with me to the end, for enduring the rain and the gunpowder alongside me. We'll see each other very soon with another story that no one else dares to tell. Until the next storm, take care, and keep the door locked with just 1 bolt. You never know who might save your life on the other side.